Hey Rexburg artists. So one of the things I hear from students who are just learning to work in watercolor is that it's really hard to control. Now that's probably true. Watercolor is a very expressive medium. But I actually think that that's one of the strengths that it has. So I'm going to show you some different techniques in 4 different projects, all based on the idea of painting clouds. Alright, first thing you're going to need is some paper. You're also going to need watercolor paint. This is what your little tray looks like. You'll need a good brush. This is the brush that came with the watercolor kit. It's alright, it's useful. Next you're going to need some sponges. Any sponge will work really. You're also going to need a water container. I like to get one big enough that the water won't get too dirty. You'll need a plate, something you can mix on, and moms, these do wash off pretty easily. Some crayons would be good to have. The kit should come with a white and a yellow. And also just a little bit of salt. It doesn't matter what kind it is. The 4 projects I'm going to show you here are all cloud paintings. So you might want to find some pictures like these. Before starting our paintings, you might want to add a little bit of water to your paint to help reconstitute it so it flows easier. Alright, so this first project, we're going to explore what happens when we put a little bit of crayon on the page before we put the paint down. Now the nice thing about crayon is that it has wax in it, and wax and watercolor won't mix together, so we can use it so that we can make some light areas. Now you can see I've done a little bit of a pencil drawing in here just so I know where the edge of the cloud is. I've got a white crayon here, and I'm just going to take this white crayon and I'm going to color in some of the, right up to the edge. You can see from the photograph there that the very edge of the cloud has a bunch of light on it, kind of like a silver lining on a cloud. So I'm just going to put some white, kind of a white base on there. One hard thing about working with a white crayon is you can't see it very well. You can kind of look at it from the side, and that helps a little bit. And now we're going to switch over to yellow and just blend that across there. This is the edge of the cloud again. This yellow is actually going to stay there. We're going to always see it. And we're going to blend a little orange in it here too, because that's what the edge of the cloud looks like. And remember, all of this is waxy, and so the paint will not stick to it. And I'm just going to dive right in here and start putting some blue paint down. The edge of that cloud is light, but the rest of the cloud is kind of dark blue, and so I'm going to put that in there. I've mixed that blue up with a little bit of black and some orange, and those 2 colors will help this blue in the cloud be different from the sky blue that we're going to use next. Alright, now we're painting the sky that's behind the cloud, and it's a little bit lighter blue, a little more intense blue. We'll just scrub that in there. The nice thing is we can scrub right up against that crayon, and it won't change the color, and so we've preserved the edge of that cloud. Alright, now if you'll watch right here, as I'm painting along, I get a little bit and it spills over into a wet section. See how it's kind of blossoming out, and that little it's looking like there's a new cloud. Well, I'm going to take my sponge and I'm just going to suck some of that paint right up there. Just use that sponge and just lift that paint so that it's not running into that part. That happens anytime you have an area that is wet that's next to an area that you're working on. Alright, so I'm just going to speed it up here really quick and show how I kind of finished the sky part. Now I let it dry for a little while before I went back because I didn't want that same thing to happen with what I'm painting now as the land underneath the sky to leak up into the sky. So I had to make sure that that top part was dry enough so that it so the brown stuff underneath wouldn't leak in. So wet and wet means that we're working with wet paint into a wet surface. I'm going to start off here by just drawing in the cloud shape a little bit and then filling it in with some water to make the surface of just where I'm painting the cloud wet. There's a little bit of color in my brush. That kind of helps me just be able to see where I'm putting the water down. You can do it clear if you'd like and kind of look at it from the side. That helps. So now I'm going to start adding some color directly in to this kind of watery mess, and just kind of let the water move it around. That's one of the nice things about having a very wet surface, is that once you put the paint down, it will kind of just flow and what we call it bleeding, where it starts in one place and just goes to another place. I let that dry for a few minutes so that as I started adding in some of the blue that's on the upper part of the cloud and on the edges, this blue that I'm adding in wouldn't move around quite as much. The drier you let the surface get, and the drier the paint is, drier just meaning that it has more paint and less water, then it's easier to have a little bit more control, and your paint stays in one spot. Just keep painting down here, and then as I've done most of the outside of the cloud, I'm satisfied with that. I'm going to go in and kind of mix it so that the outside and the inside of the cloud kind of run together a little bit. I don't want them so separated that it just looks like an outline. I want them to kind of run together a little bit and look like these are natural shadows that are occurring in the cloud. Just soften that edge from the inside. Paint will soften and move around even after it's dry for a couple of days. You can go in with a damp brush and still be able to pick up a little bit of your watercolor. And you can see pretty dramatically what it looks like after it's dried. So now that it's dry, I'm mixing up some green for the mountain that's coming up to meet this cloud, mixing on that plate as a palette. And some of the paint that's underneath it's a little bit dry. If I keep scrubbing it like that, it will pick it up and kind of blend it so that it doesn't show from underneath. I'm mixing some orange into that mixture of blue and green, and it makes a really nice brown. Sometimes you can just use brown, but I like to make browns out of complementary colors like red and green. Look really good when you mix them together. Blue and orange make a nice neutral color too. I haven't done much with the border here, so what you're going to see is me making sort of the edge of the painting there just by drawing a straight line with the paint across there. Alright, we're going to turn this guy over so that we can paint the sky. Mixing up some light blue, just a touch of green in it to kind of make it feel like a warm summer sky. I'm trying to use the tip of my brush to get right up against the edge of the cloud so that it doesn't have any lap marks, any overlapping marks. Again, this is obviously sped up, but I was painting fairly quickly because I wanted the paint to still be wet so that I could show you how to apply salt onto the wet paint to make the salt stains. Now, what I didn't realize was that my camera had stopped recording right at the worst possible moment, because one of the whole points of this is I wanted to show you how to use salt in the wet paint to create these interesting little holes, or stains as they call them. This is up in the upper right hand corner. The other side, the paint had dried a little bit more, and so the salt didn't have quite the same dramatic effect as it did on the other side. So I decided I didn't really like that right hand side of the cloud, the way it just kind of dropped off. It's sometimes when you're painting upside down, you can't see what things will look like when they're right side up, so you got to turn them around. So I decided I'd come in here and I would kind of repaint that edge and make it a little bit more interesting. The paint was still a little bit wet underneath, and so painting back into it can have some problems because it won't blend directly. There'll always be evidence that I'm painting over it. I didn't waste any time after I got through painting this. While it was still really wet, I got a little pinch full of salt and threw it in the very wet sky blue paint in the corner. Watercolor painting involves paint plus water. When we talk about painting wet, we're talking about using more water and less paint. We're prepping the surface by putting some water down first. I'm using a sponge to pick up water and paint, and I'm going to squeeze the paint directly onto the surface that's already wet. As the paper gets wet, it tends to warp a little bit, so you'll get some of these gravity pools. And sometimes you can even pick it up and move the paint around. I lost a little bit of the color, so I'm going to squeeze just a little bit more in randomly. Well, this painting started out a little bit wetter, so I let it dry a little bit. I added yellow and a little bit of blue with the sponge, so it would feel random, and I helped it along a little bit too, and then I let this dry. Alright, it's time to paint the sky around the cloud, and I find the best way to do that is to turn the painting upside down so that I can paint along this edge without having to bend my arm in an unnatural way. I want to paint the sky quickly so that it all blends together. But once I get the sky done, I'm going to add a little bit of salt in. You can use your hands like this or even a salt shaker. I'm going to start painting the mountains underneath immediately. The sky is still wet, and so I have to be careful that I don't bump into that sky. So I'm painting right along the edge. And very last, I'll paint the ground that's in the front here. It's a little bit darker and a little bit greener than those mountains. I'm excited about this project, working with these dark clouds over a light sky. I'm going to start with a border and then draw just enough of the landscape and clouds so I know where they are. I'm going to use my sponge to get the surface of the page wet, and that will ensure that it doesn't get too dry as I'm painting this wash. It starts with a little bit of blue on the top, kind of goes to a green, and a bunch of yellow in the middle, and then ends at the bottom with orange. I'm going to use one of my sponges just to blend it just a little bit. I'm going to dive right in here painting these purple and orange clouds. It's always good to make sure that you mix up enough of the paint in the right color so that you don't have to try to recreate it every time. Also, you can make small adjustments to that pile of paint. So, for instance, as it goes a little more orange towards the horizon, then you can just add more orange to it. There's an orange glow coming from underneath the clouds, and so I've mixed up some paint that has more paint in it and less water. We call that dry because you're using more paint than water. It's easier to control the paint when it's a little drier because it doesn't tend to flow and bleed and move around on you. Once you put it down, it kind of stays in one place. So as the paint dries on the page and I put drier paint in the paintbrush, then I have a little bit more control to paint the clouds and make them a little bit more detailed. The paint was still kind of flowing and bleeding, so I let the clouds dry just for a few minutes, and now you can see that as I paint them a little bit more with that same dark purple, it's not moving around quite as much. Alright, so now the sky's done, and I'm going to start doing these mountains that are way off in the distance. They're kind of a light purple, purplish blue. I put a little bit of black in there too. Well, this one's just getting finished up. I had some of that effect of the light reflecting in the water and the darker foreground. Overall, though, I think this painting turned out pretty good. Alright guys, well, we're coming to the end of the video. Hopefully I've been able to show you some interesting techniques using crayons and salt stains and wet in wet and wet over dry, and working with tools like sponges, and has kind of given you some good ideas of how you could make some really neat watercolor paintings. So get out there and get some done. All different kinds, doesn't really matter. I just dumped water on myself.